We've talked about the importance of authentication, but we also have a few methods which we need to be aware of for the Security Plus exam. We're going to have that conversation starting right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to the Security Plus series here at IT Pro TV, and today we are talking authentication methods, ways in which we can authenticate with different and sundry systems. Wes, you're going to walk us through the ones we need to be aware of for the Security Plus exam, kind of important thing.
That's right.
So we'll go ahead and let you get started. Where do we begin with this conversation?
Put a little method to the madness.
There you go.
That's absolutely right. So let's go ahead and do about a 10-second recap of what authentication is. Remember, we talked in a previous episode that we talked about IAAA, right? Identity, authentication, authorization, and accounting, or like Dan mentioned, synonymous with auditing, which I do agree is the more proper term. That authentication, right? That is validation of a set of credentials. Now, what we want to talk about a little bit around that authentication concept are some of the methods that we have that allow us to actually perform that authentication, or I should say an authentication system, if you will. And that's what we're going to dive into this episode. We're going to talk about 4 concepts. I believe I've got 4 concepts. I think there might be 5. We'll see. We're going to talk about this one here. Big thing in the enterprise and corporate space, something known as a directory service or directory services, if you will. Yes, believe it or not, there are more than one services in a directory sometimes. We're going to talk about federation. Don't worry about it. This isn't the stormtroopers coming to get you. And we're also going to talk a little bit about SSO, and really these kind of blend into these two. Directory services and federation is a way that we can achieve an SSO. So we will touch briefly on it because it should be in here inside of authentication methods. We're also going to look at something known as attestation. So I do remember my numbers here. I can count to 4.
Yeah, counting is hard.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started. Dan, what do you say with directory service?
Yeah, because we find directory services, if you've ever used a Windows system with like Active Directory, that directory part means directory services. So it's probably something we need to know about because it is extremely popular and very widely used.
Most definitely. So let's go ahead and, before we actually dive into directory services, the what, let's talk a little bit about the why. All right. Now I want you to think about it, right? If you're in a very small home environment or we say Soho, right? Small office, home office, right? Maybe you've got a maximum of 10 computers, and in a Microsoft world, in those environments, that's what they call a peer-to-peer network. And they call them a peer-to-peer modeling network. If you remember back from your Network Plus days, right? And some of that entry-level networking fundamentals, right? Their peer-to-peer network, they're called peers because every machine or computer within that network, they're equal, right? Sometimes they act like clients. Sometimes they act like servers, right? And that's in contrast to the most common model we have in corporate environments today that scales up, and that's the client-server model, right? So going back to the peer-to-peer network, right? I want you to think about it. If you've got 10 people that you need to make sure they have access to each one of those 10 computers. I'm just keeping my math a little simple for me, right? Nice round numbers of 10s, right? So if you think about that, if I want 10 people to have access to all 10 computers in this small network, I need to go to each one of those computers. Let's take computer 1, and I need to create 10 user accounts. I then have to go to the second computer, and I need to create 10 user accounts. Now, keep in mind, if I want this to be transparent to your end users, then you need to make sure that their passwords are all the same on the first computer and the second computer, and then we need to go to the third and the 4th, and counting right up to 10. So that's an administrative nightmare. That's an administrative complexity in just 10 computers. What if you had 1,000 computers? What if you had 1,000 users? What if you had 1,000 users in one location?
My brain just blue screened.
That's right. Now, Dan, I know you've worked on within very large networks, right? Like you did support, right? And you had thousands of users, right, at many locations.
Correct.
Geographically dispersed, right?
Yes, sir.
Can you imagine how bad it would be to individually manage every one of those accounts?
Forget about the management for a second. The money it would take to make that happen is not economically viable.
That's right. So here's a little bit about the why of a directory service, right? That's a decentralized model, the one we were basically setting you up for failure if you're going to try to attempt this. So we need a centralized model. And that's where our directory service comes in. And that's the why. Directory services are a way that you can store all the objects within your networks, and you can centrally manage them. All right. So directory services, what can we do when we say we can centrally manage things? We can manage things like users and groups. We can manage things, they can get stored in the directory service, right? Computers. Now, computers can be not just individual computers, they could be workstations, they could be servers, right? You can have thousands of servers. Can you imagine having to go to every individual server and create those user accounts so that these users and groups can have access to those resources? But not only that, they also have things like your printers. Your printer is a shareable resource. Can you imagine having thousands of printers that you need to gain or manage access to? All right. Not only that, but we also have things like volumes, folders. Think about file servers out there, as well as other things too, like services. All right. And all of that gets stored in what's known as a directory service database. All right. The directory services database is really nothing more than like a phone book of all the objects within your network. And you can centrally manage it. Now, let me be careful with that, because when I say centrally manage it, it doesn't mean that you're going to only have one server. Now, if you have like what they call an SMB, small to medium business, maybe, but I doubt it, right? Because what happens if that server fails? Nobody has access to anything. So when I say centrally manage it, keep in mind that a lot of times, Dan mentioned Active Directory, you're going to have maybe hundreds of these servers, but the database that they contain is one database where all of these objects are located. And that's one of the benefits of having a directory service at your disposal.
That's a great thing that you brought up, I think, because it can be, if we don't have experience with these things, it can kind of lose us mentally when we try to scale it up. We just can't fathom what that is or get an idea of that. So to get that idea of, yeah, I've got a copy of the database. Wes has a copy of the database. If I go down and I'm unable to serve my clients, well, Wes can take over and pull that weight until I'm back on my feet. That's the idea. But the database, even though two different copies, still the same thing, or at least it should be. That's the idea.
Most definitely.
And it keeps everything rocking and rolling. And I like the idea that we're talking about these different objects in a directory. Now that means there's going to be a standard by which these objects need to be referenced through. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Definitely. So this is all part of the X dot specification. Now that specification has been around a long time. I'm talking back to the early days of the 70s. Like, for instance, maybe those of you that are coming out of maybe Network Plus and coming in here, maybe you've heard of X.25, the old networks that we were connected to. Maybe you've heard and seen our certificate-based episode where we talked about X.509. All right, well, directory service is actually formally standardized under something known as the X.500 standard. Now, I only put that standard up here. I'm not sure if they're going to ask you it on the exam, but I want you to be aware of it nonetheless. So you're aware that this is a standardized method of centrally managing all the objects within your network. Now, how are they identified? All right, just briefly, the objects are represented by what's known as a distinguished name. And a distinguished name, it has a format like this. All right, we can see we've got certain maybe containers, if you will. Maybe we have an organizational unit, maybe a domain component as well. But this is what it looks like to the database, and this is how they're stored in a database. And I want you to be able to recognize that just on the exam if they say, hey, the directory service, which one of these is how we identify objects within a directory services database? If you see an IP address, you know that's probably not the right answer. This is going to be the answer. Let's break this down a little bit more when we talk about a distinguished name.
Thank you, Wes, because that was a lot of gobbledygook if you're not familiar with what the heck it's even talking about, right?
That's right. So let's go ahead and do that exact thing, Dan. Let's break them down one by one, all right? So this is an example of a distinguished name that's within the directory services database that I created. And what we have are some components here. The CN is what's known as a common name. The OU is what's known as an organizational unit name. Then you have two domain components, typically the domain name and then whatever you might see .com on the end, .net, depending on what your domain namespace is. In this case, this is how that breaks down. You have a common name, an organizational unit name, and then two domain components. And I just want you to be aware of the format, be able to identify it on the exam more for the purposes of, hey, this is a distinguished name. Now, I don't know if you're going to have to know the individual components, but if you do, you'll be aware of that for the exam.
All right. Well, now that we know a little bit about directory services, let's jump ship and kind of move over to federation or federated services.
Sure. And I'm glad that you put both, because I mentioned federation. What do you mean federation services? Are they the same?
Well,
it's absolutely that's absolutely correct. It's kind of a synonymous term. So let me set you up with a kind of why we would want something like this. All right, we got two companies here, right? let's focus on company one, right? Company one has identities, all right? Let's say just their employees, right? And they need to log into a web application. Well, don't worry about company two for now. Just let's focus on that company one. When company one wants to figure out, hey, are you an authenticated user? Should you have access to this web application? Company one checks its local database. Let's say a directory service in that case. And yeah, you know what? You're an authorized user. You gain access to the web application. All right. Now, how about company two? Well, company two, they've got some identities that are stored within their database. And if they log into services on the company two's network, well, guess what? They gain access to company two's resources, right? That's just standard across companies, all right? But what happens if we say, maybe Dan's company makes toys? Maybe my company, maybe we make toy components, right? So, well, what are we going to do? Well, we might not merge, but maybe we want both companies to have access to certain resources, right? So if company two, without any federation, let's say that they tried to reach across boundaries, all right, which is essentially what a domain is inside of a directory service. What's going to happen? They're going to try to, let's say, access that web application. That web application is going to check company one's identity data store, or identity store, if you will. And guess what? They're going to say, I don't know who you are. Company two employees. Who the heck is that?
You're not my company.
That's right. You're not my company. I don't trust you. You don't gain access.
And ultimately, that's right. That's how that should be, right? If I don't know who you are, I sure as heck shouldn't trust you when it comes to the digitalness.
Definitely, you know. So this is about establishing a trust relationship between two identity sources, if you will. So for instance, if we set up what's known as a federation, all right, now what happens is set up the federation, federation's in play. Let's go ahead and start that scenario over again. Company two employees, they go to access the web application across these two companies. Well, guess what company one's going to do? They're going to see that incoming connection request, and company one's going to say, well, wait a second. Company two, we established a trust relationship with you. Are these identities, are they trusted? Can I trust them? All right, so we're reaching across that federation back to company two, and company two is going to say, yeah, guess what? Those are our identities, and we trust them. And because of that federation, these two different systems allow for access between the companies, right? So now we do, yes, these identities are verified. You can trust them. Company one says, hey, I trust what you say here. You're validating those identities, and now they gain access. Now, this is something that happens probably more than what you think. Definitely happens in corporate environments, but with the exponential growth of the cloud, we actually do this a lot today.
Wes, is this when I see that sign in with your Google account thing? Is that what we're talking about here?
It's exactly what it is, Dan. Exactly what it is. In the earlier days, prior to there being these massive networks, these providers, if you will, that have hundreds of millions, billions now of identities, right? You would have to set this up. There was in Active Directory, it would have been called Active Directory Federation Services, right? But you also see this, and I do want to go ahead and clarify some terms that you might hear when it comes to federation, all right? Notice that company one, they're providing a service. In this case, this is the web application that's providing the service. The identity provider is the one that we're allowing to come into our network. So keep those terms in your mind. As we move into something you probably are familiar with, like Dan said, I log into a web application, right? When the user logs in, they're going to go basically through the service provider, right? Well, the service provider is going to use an identity provider, all right? That identity provider, and I'll talk about what some of these other options are here, the SAML, OpenID, and OAuth, right? All right, they're going to reach to somebody who has a database of identities. That's an identity provider. You've probably seen these companies before. All right, Google has a massive identity database out there, and guess what? You can contract for a service to use their identities to log into your web application. That is a form of a federation. All right, Facebook, hundreds of millions of users, right? They have a massive pool of identities. You can connect through contract, right? This is definitely a service that they're going to provide. And you can connect through things like the security assertion markup language or OpenID and OAuth. These are ways that you can securely connect to identity provider and provide that authentication. Definitely want you to be aware of those protocols and those technologies, and they allow you to log into this app. Now, if you've ever done this on things like Google, if you've ever done this on things like Facebook, this is where the SSO comes in that we're talking about, right? Single sign-on. When I log into Gmail, all right, give you an example. When I log into Gmail, guess what I can do from there? I can turn around and go to any other portion of the G Suite, whether it's Google Docs, right, and some of the other options that they have, and I don't have to re-enter my credentials, right? That's essentially what single sign-on is. We use it so much today that we kind of take it for granted that that's behind the scenes. What's really happening is a federation. So be aware of some of the terms. Again, service provider, I'm logging into a web application. They're providing that service. The service provider then uses an identity provider, such as the public ones that we've seen here. All right, you connect from the service provider to the identity provider with these technologies, security assertion markup language, OpenID, and OAuth, and then they validate that that person is who they say they are. But they're the identity provider, and they're the ones that are going to help on with the authentication on the back end. A lot of times handled all through your web APIs.
Now, Wes, in a previous episode, in our IAAA episode, you talked about the idea of attestation. Would that be also another one of these methods that we need to learn about?
Well, if you think about attestation, attestation is that if I have, like for instance, let me show you where one of the most common places of attestation is. All right. I can attest that something is the way I want it to be, all right? And I'm expecting something to be the way I want it to be, right? Well, how do I verify that? Attestation, one of the ways that we use that is in things like your TPMs where we've talked about before. So we have a client computer, all right? This client computer, we expect a certain configuration, all right? When we start up that computer, that information that's held down there in the TPM, the Trusted Platform Module, again, has a configuration state, all right? Now, that configuration state needs to be a certain way, if you will, a certain, let's say, security baseline, right? And any deviation for that means that the configuration state isn't what we expect, right? Well, that could be through maybe an update, but it could be a malicious means, right? So for instance, one of the harder things to find on a client computer or any computer is things like a rootkit, all right? Because what do? They can store themselves so low that you can't really, the operating system doesn't see them, the CPU doesn't see them. However, if when that computer shuts down, we expect it to be in a certain state, and when it boots up, that rootkit runs, it's going to be in an altered state, one that is not adhering to the corporate security policy, right? So when this computer boots up, what it does is it takes that configuration state, all right, and it's basically just going to wrap that up into a file, and it says, here's how I'm configured right now. And it takes that message and it sends it out to an attestation server. The attestation server says, all right, I see the configuration. Let's say Dan's the security administrator. Dan says, I want this security baseline. All of the client computers on my network have to boot up and be configured like this. That's the policy. The attestation server looks at the configuration state and says, what's the security policy here? And let's do a comparison. Dan's policy says it should be configured this way. Client computer saying this is what I have. If they are in agreement, then guess what? You gain access to the resources inside of the corporate network, all right? However, if that same process happens and what is expected or required by the policy is not what we see inside of the configuration state, you're not going to get the little green check mark. Instead, quite the opposite, you're going to either not be allowed, well, first of all, you're not going to be able to access the corporate network, but a couple of things could happen. And I didn't put it in the diagram here, but you could be kicked off to a remediation network, all right? So let's say, for instance, Dan says, corporate security policy says your firewall must be turned on, signatures must be up to date, definitions, right, for your antivirus software. All right, we shut the computer down, it's out of date, and the firewall's turned off, right? You send that to the attestation server says, I don't know, Dan's policy says this, I'm not seeing that. So, you know what? We're going to give you restricted access. And maybe we don't just completely kick you out. We send you over to a remediation network that has a server in it that has all of the up-to-date definitions for your antivirus software and will automatically configure the firewall and turn it back on, right? Now that happens, you regenerate the configuration file, send it back up to the attestation server, compares it and says, okay, you're good to go. And now you gain access into the corporate network. I will tell you, one of the most common places I've seen this, Dan, you were asking like, where's a way that you see this is in Microsoft's in Windows, they have the measured boot. All right, which is exactly like an attestation type thing where it says, all right, we've measured what everything should look like when you boot up your files. If anything looks different, you don't gain access to the network. And it's really a good thing, not only just for your security baselines, but sometimes it's a good way to catch things like rootkits and stuff that modify the system and the operating system isn't actually even aware of them. So that's a little bit about what attestation is.
I like it. It's an interesting topic and something we need to be aware of for the Security Plus exam. That being said, we're running a little bit low on time. Could you briefly run us through the idea of using things like tokens and one-time passwords for authentication?
Dan, I would love to, but we've got a little bit more meat, that we have to talk about when it comes to authentication methods. So what do you say, Dan? We're going to go ahead and we will stop authentication methods here, and we'll have another episode coming up called, additional authentication methods.
Ooh, I like it. A cliffhanger. Always leave them wanting more, right? That's what they say. Well, there you go. We've looked at some really useful authentication methods that we typically see. We've got a few more to go over, so we got to definitely jump over into that episode. As for this one, we're going to call it a day. Plenty more to come in the series as well, so be sure to join us for that. Until then, everybody have a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.